Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today I'm going to be reviewing Persona 5 Royal for the Nintendo Switch. Let's just ignore the meme about Persona 5 taking its sweet time to come to the Switch, and just be thankful that by the time it finally did come, we got the Royal version, which many people who have played both have considered the definitive version. Now, normally when I play a remaster or reimagining of a game, I like to go over the new features. However, from what I've researched, since I never played the original game, Royal's additions are huge, and it goes beyond just quality of life touch-ups. Like, there's massive amounts of new content. So rather than going over that, because that itself could take up half of this review's time, I will just treat this as a standalone game and just casually mention additions to Royal when they naturally come up. My experience with the Persona series has been pretty limited, but I've had a decent time with the games that I have played. I played both versions of Tokyo Mirage Sessions, which is more of a spin-off of Shin Megami Tensei, but it still has the basic battle mechanics of Persona. I played a little bit of Shin Megami Tensei 5. That was, I couldn't get past Chapter 1. And then I also played Persona 5 Strikers, which is a sequel to Persona 5, so it's interesting that the sequel came out before the prequel. So I knew the general gist of the battle system, and that definitely helped me get far ahead in the early battles. But as far as the vanilla Persona 5 experience, my earliest exposure to this gang of characters was through Smash, and they kind of spoiled a few things, so I hope you don't look too far into those spirit battles. Persona 5 Royal is the type of game that divides itself into two distinct sections. The first section is when you play as a normal high schooler that you get to name. I've heard that the default name is Ren, and you do just a normal school life where you answer questions in school to get rewarded with more knowledge stats, more on that later, study to get more knowledge stats, a lot of knowledge stats here, and just choose when you want to hang out with significant people in your life. The more you hang out, the more benefits that you get in battle once you get into the palaces segment of the gameplay. This school life / ordinary life section may be very annoying to some people, as it does feel like a lot of these actions are very repetitive and grindy, and that it's just a lengthy preparation for the battles, which are the real fun of the game. But I am kind of on the middle ground there. I found that it was confusing at first, especially when I was asked to navigate the underground railways and the schools, because I was homeschooled and haven't been on underground trains very much, but very quickly the game teaches you how to fast travel, and then you don't really have to do a whole lot of exploring. The game's environments are pretty cramped anyway, so it's not like exploration is really encouraged. Although if you do go off the beaten path, you find quite a lot of very interesting items and characters that can really help you out. What's important to remember about Persona 5 is that it has an in-game calendar that keeps track of every individual day. Unlike Fire Emblem Three Houses, you don't really get a day off. Every single day you have an option to do, well, whatever it is you want. Some days are taken up by scripted events in the game's story, but more often than not, there are often large pauses in the narrative where the characters catch their bearings or wait for something to happen. So you'll have to maximize your time efficiently before the next day starts. Sometimes you'll even have an objective that you have to complete, and if you don't complete it by the time the day's counter is finished, then you'll actually get a game over. So micromanaging your time is extremely important. And the amount of things that you can do opens up dramatically. New to the Royal version, there's an entirely new area where you can go hang out, which contains new activities such as a darts minigame that involves motion sensing. It was hit or miss for me, honestly. Nowhere else in the game are you required to use motion control, so that was a weird exception. There's a jazz club there, and overall it just opens up a lot more opportunities for hanging out. There's a few new confidants, which are this game's version of support partners that you might have seen in the Fire Emblem games, and most of these hangouts are not voiced, which kind of takes away the immersion a little bit. I found myself kind of zoning out during a lot of these conversations because I was like, well, they're not voiced, so it's hard for me to take them seriously when it's just a bunch of dialogue boxes when these characters should be crying or suffering or going through a hard time. That being said, the rewards for persevering through the Hangouts are extremely great, as again, they add to the battles segment, and you just overall feel a nice sense of progression as you go from a bumbling idiot to a really charming guy. You can choose your responses in conversations, and while most of the time these don't matter as they're just different ways of wording the same effect, they matter quite a lot when it comes to the Hangouts, as saying the right things can increase your affinity points, which can allow you to level up your friendship meter faster. Each person has 10 stars of friendship, with one particular character having 5 for some reason. And once you get to max level, then you get either a really awesome skill that you can't get anywhere else, or in the case of your party members, they can even, again, more on that later, in the battle, and can unlock a really powerful skill. So now that we've finished talking about what you can do to prepare for the battles, why don't we talk about the battles themselves? So the characters in this game have the ability to travel to what is called the cognitive world, which is basically an artistic rendering of how a person sees the world. So for example, if someone is a sexual abuser, there might be a lot of provocative imagery and like slave-like characters. Or if someone is, say, an artist, then there's a lot of artistic inspiration to the level design. And this also extends to the enemies and boss battles as well. And it's really amazing how much this game takes concepts that are more vague and abstract and puts them into tangible things, which I really like because I'm not really the vague or abstract kind of guy. And even I could say, oh, yeah, that is nice. That's how it would be represented in a physical form. The dungeons you explore around in third person, but then when you encounter an enemy, you can choose between ambushing or just running right up to the enemy. But if the enemy catches you, then they'll get the advantage in battle. Then the battles become turn-based. You can choose between attacking, defending, using your gunshot or a slingshot in the case of some of your party members, or using your persona's abilities. Now, a persona is like this ghost-like character that sort of represents the rebellious nature of your heart. So each person gets a unique persona with unique abilities, except for the main character, Joker. They all have code names in the metaverse, whereas he can equip multiple personas. And the way that you get more personas is that if you knock an enemy down with the enemy's weakness, which oftentimes requires the persona to give you the ability to knock down the enemy, but you don't kill the enemy, then you can bargain to see if the enemy will join your party. You can also ask for money or for items, but seeing as money and items are so easy to get, I oftentimes just spammed the lend me your power option, and depending on the enemy's personality, what you say will determine if that enemy will join your party, just leave you an item, or say, well, screw you, let's just get back to the battle. And if the enemies refuse to talk, you can do an all-out attack where all of your party members just assault the enemies and deal massive amounts of damage. And yes, it's Joker's final smash in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, and it looks pretty much identical, except that the enemies spew blood instead of stars, because this is, an M-rated game, and there's a lot of sensitive materials. When you're not battling the enemies, you'll sometimes have to solve light environmental puzzles. Some of these can get pretty darn harrowing, especially when you have to micromanage multiple floors of the dungeon, but thankfully the map usually makes it very clear where you haven't explored yet, and it also usually makes it clear when you're about to go to another floor. And I really like how you can get more maps so that you don't feel overwhelmed by too many new areas. Usually the map marks important areas. If there's a door that you can't get through, it'll mark it with a lock symbol. And overall navigation is quite nice, especially because there are these rooms called safe rooms, which you can fast travel to once you've unlocked them. They let you save your game as well as use exclusive healing items that you can't use anywhere else, and ask your team about how far you think you'll have to go into the palace. So it gives you a nice progress report, and from what my friend told me, there are more safe rooms than there were in the original Persona 5. So it's even easier to resume your progress if you're not playing on the easiest difficulty, which allows you to restore all of the health and skill points of if your main character gets knocked down, which is exclusive to safe mode. With the other difficulty levels, you either have to reset the battle or restart from the nearest safe room, or even reset from a couple of days before if you really want to correct your error. Now, new to the Royal version, some of the boss battles have been tweaked so that there are new phases, and cognitive characters will also appear. So a lot of them feel much more grand and involved than they did in the original game, or at least so I've been told. I don't really have too many references to compare, but I do think it's interesting that they took the Majora's Mask 3D approach, where they have the same bosses but different attack patterns and different strategies. There are also a few redesigns of the palaces to make account for two new items that you get, which are the grappling hook and the will seeds. The grappling hook appeared in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate as Joker's recovery, but it surprisingly wasn't used in the original game. Now you can use it to reach areas that you couldn't before, or to skip large annoying areas from the original game. And I find that this is such a cool maneuver that I can't imagine how the palaces would have been designed otherwise. It seems like it just flows so naturally into the gameplay. As far as the will seeds, there are 3 hidden in each palace, and all of them are new to Royal, so this encourages players who have played the original game to try to see what's changed. And if you trade the will seeds to a particular character, then you can get new items and accessories which give you new abilities. Now, there's also a place called the Velvet Room, which you can get to at the entrance of each palace, as well as designated areas in the overworld. And the Velvet Room is this really weird dungeon-like area where your character is treated like a prisoner, and you can use it to take the personas that you've collected in the palaces and fuse them together by really brutal executions for some reason to make even more powerful persona. You can then choose a trait that that persona has, which is basically a passive ability, and choose which skills from the previous personas you want to carry over into this new one. And if you've hung out with certain people enough, then that confidant power-up will apply to that persona and will give you additional powers and additional experience points. A few new additions to the Velvet Room from the Royal version are sometimes alarms will sound, which will allow you to fuse more powerful persona, but sometimes it can also backfire and completely change some of the powerful skills that you have to be either less powerful or a completely new skill altogether. You can also do challenge battles where you can go up against gauntlets of enemies. From what I've heard, you can even fight the protagonists of previous Persona games, although I didn't really test this a whole lot, as I'm not really the type that likes challenge battles too much in video games. So I mostly actually I totally ignored this. Thankfully, you don't have to spend too much time in the Velvet Room, but it is a good way to get rid of your stock of personas, especially if they get to be the low level variety, and use them to get to a higher level. Although keep in mind that you can't fuse a persona that's a higher level than that of your character. So now that we've finished discussing the basic gameplay changes, let's get into some of the more major elements of Persona 5 Royal that separate it from the original Persona 5. Again, this would take way too long if I listed everything, but from a few things that I've gleaned, and I'll put a link in the description of the source that I read to get most of this information, there are quite a few new characters, including one character in the opening chapter that briefly joins you, and from what I've been told, she has a huge role going forward. There are 2 new endings, an entirely new school semester, a new palace that you can explore, although I've been told that this requires maxing out the level of your confidant relationship with the counselor character in order to unlock it, so keep that in mind. There are also 2 new endings. I got the bad ending, which is why I'm able to review this game too soon, but don't worry, I will be starting another file to get the better endings. Just remember to save twice when the game prompts you to save before the story greatly progresses, in pretty much those exact words. So keep that in mind. Don't save over your file like I did, or you'll have to start the entire game over. You do have a New Game Plus option after you get an ending, but I found that it didn't really work for me. Maybe it's just a problem with the Switch version, because I haven't heard anyone else complaining about it. But just keep in mind that you might have to start a new file even if you tell the game that you want to carry over the New Game Plus stuff. A couple of other things I've heard are there are a variety of balance tweaks. You don't have to go to sleep as much. There are some new skills, new personas, a lot of new stuff. Also, one of the characters that you would automatically level up your confidant relationship, you now can manually hang out with this character. I won't say who it is because that character appears relatively late. And overall, I feel like I didn't catch a whole lot of the changes right away because they did so seamlessly blend into the base experience. One notable exception, though, was in the character of Jose, who appears once you enter an area called Mementos. Think of Mementos as a randomly generated dungeon where you can take on mini bosses that don't have entire palaces, but are still causing enough trouble to be distorted shadows. Since the layout is randomly generated in Mementos, you kind of just have to wander around and hope that you can get to the exit to get to the next area. During this time, you can find a character that will take the flowers that you've gathered during your time at Mementos, and you can use those to buy items, some of which are either exclusive, or you can use them to buy the will seeds that you might have missed in the palaces, as after you've defeated the final boss of a palace, that palace will no longer be accessible. So this can be a good way of repurchasing them. You can also collect stamps, and he can use these stamps to change various elements of when you're exploring Mementos, such as increasing the amount of experience you get or increasing the money you get from the enemies. Sadly, it only applies to Mementos. This doesn't apply to the entire game, but it's still better than nothing. Overall, I found Mementos to be kind of annoying at first because you're told that you have to rush through the areas to avoid getting jumped on by a character called the Reaper. Thankfully, the Reaper was so slow that I was able to ignore him, but it did conjure up considerable sensation of dread in me that I haven't felt for quite a while since Majora's Mask. So that is really nice. I do like the fact that Mementos is kept optional most of the time, although I do recommend that you try to get rid of the side quests that are automatically unlocked as soon as you can, as some of those will allow you to hang out a little bit more. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is that some hangouts are not only locked behind Mementos content, but upon your stats. Now you have 5 different stats: knowledge, kindness, charm, proficiency, and guts. And the more you have of these stats, the more bonuses you're able to get. One particular character doesn't let you hang out with her at all until you have enough kindness. And depending on what you do in your free time, these can level up these stats. Usually it's for the most part pretty logical how you would level up a certain stat. If you're at the batting cage, that'll increase your proficiency because it's all about hand-eye coordination. And if you are taking on a challenge of eating a giant burger, that'll increase your guts. Some of them are a bit weird, like watching a movie about a stirring protagonist teaches you how to be kind. But for the most part, these all make sense, and some of them have other passive benefits as well, such as crafting at your house, which will give you more items from the materials you grab in the palaces, which will, as a bonus, increase your proficiency. Or if you water your flower, that'll give you kindness points while not taking up time, like most hangout events do. So Persona 5 overall just does a nice job of immersing you in a long-lasting story, where every single action you take adds up to help you feel like it's easier to conquer the cognitive world, and vice versa. Overall, I think the story is It's not spectacular, but it does hit on a lot of heavy subject materials, as the earliest palace in the game tackles the heavy subject of physical and sexual abuse, and the game doesn't pull any punches in being as graphic as possible. But unlike a lot of JRPGs, I think Persona 5 does a pretty good job of making sure that you know that the character of whom you're infiltrating his palace is disgusting and an absolutely abhorrent human being. And it really got me to think, like, am I treating girls with respect, or am I just like him in the way that I'm viewing them, with the way that this game externalizes victims of sexual abuse? And so it's a good way to get me thinking. I also found that the voice acting was, for the most part, pretty good, although there were a few instances where either the game just refused to have voice acting, although I have heard that the Royal version has more voice acting than the original, so that's something. But the times that I didn't like the voice acting were when they forced adult actors to sound too much like teenagers. And given that a lot of your free time takes place at a high school, there's a lot of teenage characters in this game. Although I do find that most of the dialogue for the teenagers was written very realistically. Well, as realistically as you can in a game that takes place in Japan, and it's trying to sound like a trendy American game. Sometimes the game just pretends that it's a it pretends that it isn't a localization and just uses a lot of Japanese terminology that sounds iffy when translated directly, but at least it's better than weird localization changes I've heard in other games, especially some of the ones Nintendo has published. And I overall really like the feeling of camaraderie the game gives. Sometimes there are just these wholly unnecessary vacations that the teenagers will take, or times when the characters will just say, hey, let's go to a buffet and just have fun. And it doesn't necessarily correlate with the story, but it's just cool to see the way these characters develop and grow amongst each other. And I think that's a theme of the game as a whole. It encourages you to take your time, quite literally, because that's what the loading screens say, and really get to know the characters of the game and don't just treat them as, oh, yet another NPC. It excels in not rushing its way through the plot. Now, that may be a big detractor for a lot of you, is that the game is very slow and very, like, it takes its sweet time. It's about a 150-hour game, so expect to put a lot of investment in it, especially if you plan on getting the good ending, unlike yours truly. So, if I do have any negative things to say about Persona 5, most of them revolve around the nitpicks and how long it takes to be able to have freedom and hanging out, as your options are rather limited at first, but they quickly open up. And I did max out every skill except for guts without trying super hard, so don't feel like you have to be forced to go out of your way and feel panicked if you don't get everything done right away, as I found that the game more often than not gave you more than enough time to complete your objectives, and I never had to worry about getting to the deadline and being like, oh no, I'll get a game over. I think people might be annoyed that the game forces you to use the control pad instead of the control stick when selecting an option, as the left stick really is only used for when you're moving around in 3D space, but selecting everything requires the control pad for some reason. I also think the camera controls are a bit limited in the overworld, especially in that stuffy old cafe, whereas they work perfectly fine in the palace, so I wish they had found a better balance to let you be able to see what's going on around you more. But apart from that, if you can look past the insane amount of playtime and how long the game takes to get going and get through the various story events, you're in for a fantastic time that deals with very mature subject matters. Definitely not a game for kids, but if you can have the stomach to handle sexual abuse talked about very early on in the game, and even still gets continued to be brought up, then you're in for a story that gets you thinking. A game that artistic and intuitive people will really love to see how creative it can get. And you'll also have a great time with the RPG mechanics and dungeon exploration. I think the $60 price tag is pretty well justified in this game's case, as you're getting so much content, so much more than the original game. And the New Game Plus ought to keep you going to find new side quests and new characters a second time around. So with that, thank you very much for watching. Let me know down in the comments if I left anything out, and if you have any comments, questions, concerns, or critiques, especially if you want to tell me that this was too long. I'd like to thank my patrons, Matthew Rakowski, Spoon Ghost, and Splatcat for supporting me financially. If you would like to join my Patreon, the link is in the description. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!
Your power's incredible, Joker!